Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Very excited today about a first-time guest, much requested guest here on the Remnant. I don't have his bio in front of me because I'm completely unprepared in my hotel room here, but he's a psychologist, went to Yale, went to Cambridge for his PhD, has a very popular Substack, and he has a new book out. His first book, Troubled, a memoir of foster care, family, and social class. Rob Henderson, welcome to the Remnant.
Thank you, Jonah. Great to be here.
Okay. First question I always ask authors when I have them on here is, what's your book about? So, what's your book about?
Yeah. Well, it's a book. So it's a memoir, and it documents my unusual path to higher education. I open the book in the preface introducing the reader to my story through my three names. Robert, Kim, Henderson. Each of these names was taken from a different adult in my life. My first name, Robert, comes from my biological father, whom I've never met. I was born into poverty in Los Angeles, and my mother and I, for a time, we were homeless, and then we lived in a car, and then we settled in this slum apartment in LA. And my mom was heavily addicted to drugs, and when I was 3, I was placed into the foster care system in LA. And the police and forensic psychologists and other people involved in my case asked my mother, where's this boy's father? You're not in a position to care for him. And she said she didn't know who he was. She said his name was Robert, and I was named after him. But beyond that, she had no information on his whereabouts or anything else. And so that was my first name. My second name comes from my mother, Kim. It was her family name. She came to the U.S. from Seoul, from South Korea. And so I, knew that I was half Korean just from, my mother. But I went my whole life not knowing about my father's side of the family until last year. I took this 23andMe genetic ancestry test and found that I'm half Hispanic on my father's side. So he was Mexican. And, I went my whole life not knowing this about myself. And so now what I tell people is that, before that test, I went to bed white adjacent, and then I woke up as an underrepresented minority. And then my last name, Henderson, comes from my adoptive father. So after 7 different foster homes, eventually I was adopted by this working class family, and we settled in this dusty town in Northern California called Red Bluff. And, for a time we were together, and I took my adoptive family's last name and was raised by my adoptive mother, my adoptive father, and gained a sister who was their biological daughter. She became my adoptive sister. Then they divorced shortly thereafter, and then I lived with my mom. My adoptive father was angry at my mother for divorcing him and cut off contact with me to retaliate. And this was, I'd say I was 9 years old by this point, and already I'd lived quite a bit of life. And there were a series of family tragedies and financial catastrophes and more separations and divorces and plenty of other drama, which we can get into. But this is sort of the life that I had led. And by the time I was 17, I fled as soon as I could, enlisted in the Air Force. The short version is I managed to turn my life around, went to Yale on the GI Bill, went to Cambridge on scholarship. And the book documents my personal experiences, but also I bring in some research, some survey data, some interesting research findings from psychology and sociology and other disciplines to help explain the class system in America. I coined this term luxury beliefs, which I dwell on at length in the final part of the book. But it's a sort of an introspective account of my life, but then also some sociological observations and analysis as well.
So I want to get to the luxury belief stuff because I have takes. I know part of your answer to this question, but for the listeners who haven't looked at your book or haven't heard your story, how to put this? So why aren't you screwed up? Like, is it because you just happened to be this outlier who was smart and figured out a way to get out? Is it the character formation you got solely from the military? And like when you look back on it, I'm sure, because I got into trouble, I did bad things. I mean, my upbringing, I had stable married parents, different than yours, but I grew up in New York City in the 1970s and 80s. I made many bad decisions. I was ejected from every college I applied to, and I can look back on a half dozen moments where if I'd made this decision instead of that decision, things could have gone really south. And in part, my brother ended up dying from drug problems. So I saw he made a lot of those bad decisions. And so I went the other way. I can tell all sorts of just so stories about my life and say, okay, this is why I didn't turn out, I didn't go the way my brother did. When you look back on it, is it, were you saved by institutions, or are you saved by something special about yourself?
The boring answer is it's always both. It's
Right.
always a bit of nature, a bit of nurture, intrinsic qualities as well as external factors. And so, I don't want to say like now today, I'm 34 years old and I'm living in a pretty nice area and I'm doing okay financially and all that stuff. Like now I'm fine, but there were periods, I mean, I describe in the book, there were periods where I was screwed up and I was angry and full of rage and would get into misadventures and find myself just sort of narrowly evading serious injury or death or arrest. And a lot of it was just luck and timing. And like you said, there are times where it's just sheer fortunate happenstance that you don't end up. I drank and drove a lot when I was probably from the ages of 16 to maybe 22. I was probably just as likely as not to be intoxicated while I was driving. And it's just just by luck that nothing happened. So it was a bit of the institutions, like who knows how my life would have turned out if the neighbors hadn't called the police when I was with my mother in that apartment in Los Angeles when I was 3 years old, and if I hadn't been placed into the foster system. And the foster system, as I described at length in the book, is far from optimal. Some of these homes were teeming with kids. Some of them had 4 kids to a room, 2 bunk beds, 2 kids on the top bunk, 2 kids on the bottom. I recently read that Los Angeles has the most overburdened foster care system in the country. I don't know if this was the case in the 90s when I went through, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was. There's just a surplus of kids who need homes, who need placements, as the term they use, and there just aren't enough homes and parents and people available to take care of them, and so you just have this excess of children in homes. But it was probably better than the alternative. And then the military later on. That was extremely helpful for me. And so I do credit, to some extent, as imperfect as they are, institutions for helping me to redirect my life. But, I had 5 close friends growing up, and, they're arguably just as screwed up, or if not more in some cases than I was when we were younger in our teens and 20s. I had 2 friends who went to prison. I had one friend who was shot to death. He was my friend's younger brother, but he was my friend too. And, I tell this story in the book. So my friend, he was sentenced to 18 months in San Quentin prison in California. A series of DUIs and drug incidents and other things. So he went to prison for 12 months. He served 12 of his 18-month sentence. And when he got out, I had been in the military by that point for a little over, almost 2 years by that point, I think. And I tell this story in the book of our interaction where, I met up with him and I'm like, hey, man, how was prison? And he's like, hey, dude, what was the military like? And we found ourselves giving the same answers. We were like, you wake up really early, someone's yelling at you, you go to, you make your bed, you go to this place at this time, you report to this person. Every aspect of your life is tightly controlled and regimented. And it was really unpleasant, especially going from the way that we were raised with kind of neglect, little to no adult oversight, to suddenly everything is controlled around you and the way that you carry yourself and dress and everything. So we first started off by saying it really sucked at first, but as the months wore on, we found ourselves actually appreciating the structure and the boundaries and the constraints, and to know what each day was going to look like. We woke up in the morning and knew exactly what was expected of us, who to speak with if we had an issue with X, Y, or Z. The military has its own formal hierarchy, but prison has its own pecking order. And there was a comfort in that. And my friend confided in me that he liked it so much that he wished he could go back. And he actually did go back shortly after that conversation we had. And I ended up re-enlisting. So I was in the Air Force for 8 years, which may also help to explain why I'm, why I changed my life, was because, I enlisted when I was 17 and left when I was 25. And those are already transformative years for any young person, any young male. But if you spend the most formative years of your early adult life in the military, you're just naturally going to come out a different person. And so I think all of those things contributed to why I am the way I am. And so external forces, internal forces, and luck, very pat answer, but it's true.
I've traditionally been against mandatory public service stuff for basically libertarian reasons, and I've kind of changed my mind on it to a certain extent. I would still like it to be run more as a local or state thing rather than through the federal government. I just don't trust the federal government bureaucracy not to screw it up and make it wildly too ideological. But putting all that aside, like, one thing that comes out when you read your story is structure and discipline, and teaching things like delayed gratification and all sorts of like old-fashioned virtues for young men that young men by nature resist learning but benefit from when they do. Would you be in favor of some sort of, year national service, compulsory? Doesn't necessarily have to be military, but something along those lines?
Yeah, I've read both sides of this argument, and I'm kind of agnostic on it. I can see why it might be beneficial, especially as increasing numbers of young people, especially young men, increasingly, young people in general, growing up in kind of unstable homes, and young males in particular seem to benefit most from structure and from, having a male role model available. And a lot of young men don't have that. But on the other hand, the countries that have successfully implemented compulsory service, especially in the military context, I mean, these are countries like Israel and South Korea, and they have like a serious national security need for military service. And I'm not sure we could recreate their success in a country where we don't really have a national security need for it. If I don't know, if Canada flies off the handle and, decides to, you know, rattle their sabers at the US or something, then maybe. But we're safe in that context, and I just don't think it would work. Other kinds of national service, maybe besides the military, I don't know, Peace Corps or some kind of collective effort might be helpful. But yeah, I just have a skepticism toward it. Maybe I have those kind of libertarian sympathies too. I think it works for the military, but the military is very small. I think it's historically small or perhaps smaller than it's ever been. And it can work when you have this kind of agile force and when it's all volunteer and it's sort of self-selective. But, I don't know if you can, if it's compulsory, if you force people, especially people against their will, at least initially, to do something like that. I mean, that's the thing, is like, I self-selected in. Every young person who enlists does it, of their own free will. And I'm tempted to put air quotes around it because you don't really know what you're getting into. I remember I didn't expect it to be as intense and unpleasant, especially the first 6 months, the first year or so, because, the recruiter has an incentive to sugarcoat what's about to happen to you. And, it's like a universal experience of new recruits is like, God, that really sucks, and then you kind of go on and, achieve higher rank and you become a bit more respected and it becomes much better. But yeah, I don't. So it's hard enough, even for people who voluntarily choose to do it. But for people who don't, I just think it would maybe have the opposite effect. And increase this sense of rebelliousness or bitterness towards institutions or toward the government or authority figures.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of, I mean, my ambivalence is driven in large part, there's an enormous amount of public policy argument that takes place where that involves immense amounts of question begging. And so people say, mandatory public service would be really good to teach civics and cultivate a sense of social solidarity and equality and yada yada yada. And the sort of classic neoeconomy wants to say, yes, if it works, right? If government can do that, it would be, your arguments would all make a lot of sense. But there's just an enormous amount of evidence that the intended result doesn't, the law of unintended consequences comes all the time, and people reject, the baloney rejects the grinder when it comes to sort of social engineering projects, and you cannot predict that everyone will respond. I mean, and this idea, though, it goes back to, probably goes back to Sparta, but like William James had his, the moral equivalent of war argument, which is where we got the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s, which is this idea we'll take young men, and the thinking was that war brings out what is best in people, but war itself is terrible. So we'll just take the combat part out of war and train people to be the best, have all those virtues. And I would argue that 20th century progressivism is basically one extended, more equivalent to war argument. At the same time, if families are breaking down, I'm much more sympathetic than I used to be that there needs to be some other institution that steps in that provides structure, the positive male role models. And the only one that, the Boy Scouts and the military are really like the only ones that you can point to that are particular. I'm sure there are some others, but at scale, they're the ones. And so it makes me more sympathetic to at least hearing out the arguments more.
Yeah, I understand that. And, Boy Scouts, the military, and then the third one that came to mind was prison. And, I do think that, one reason why the per capita incarceration rate has increased is because, there's that old Burkean line about how, if you can't control your appetites from within, it has to come from without, something along those lines. And, as moral standards and customs and role models and respect for authority and all these things have declined, that more and more people, young men, I talk about the young male syndrome in the book, young men act out. They tend to be, very impulsive on average compared to other groups, more impulsive, more risk seeking, more thrill seeking. And, those are the people who tend to populate prisons. Regardless of culture or society, regardless of how strict the norms and the laws and the customs are, if you look at the prisons of any culture, it's going to be majority young men populating them. But I do think there are sort of degrees of how much unrestricted freedom you can have. And right now, I think, we've veered very far in the opposite direction. And I describe in the book what happens when you have, so this is the thing, like in the book, I arrived in Red Bluff. This was the late 90s. And Red Bluff is kind of a lower middle class, working class town. My adoptive mom was an assistant social worker, or my adoptive father was a truck driver. They divorced and things changed from there. But most people in my town didn't have college degrees, but they were okay. There was a bit of poverty, but it wasn't destitute. But the kind of social ills that have been plaguing the country for the last several decades, they've slowly been sort of trickling up, where initially it plagued primarily poor people, especially poor Black families and other marginalized communities. And then by the time I was a kid in the 90s and I was adopted, these social ills have reached kind of lower middle class. Where I grew up, it was mostly white, there was a large Hispanic population as well there. And so growing numbers of kids are raised by single parents, unmarried parents. I had a friend who was raised by his grandmother because his mom was on drugs and his dad was in prison. Other friends raised by single moms, one friend raised by a single dad. And that is a very common picture of kind of working class, lower middle class neighborhoods in the country now. And, I guess ideally I would prefer the kinds of boundaries and constraints and character shaping to come from families or from neighborhoods or from adults in that local environment, and not from the federal government or from some large bureaucracy. It worked for me, but I don't know. Yeah, I'm less convinced it can work at scale in that way. And I don't think, in terms of like phenomenological experience, which I focus on in the book as well, is that um, yeah, the military helped me, but it's not like it made up for. And later I got these degrees from these expensive institutions, but it's not as if these achievements and these experiences made up for those early life difficulties. And I think most people would rather have two married parents who prioritize their needs and their safety and provide mentorship and guidance and all those things, rather than spending 18 years growing up in chaos, and then they get kind of forcibly pressed into some kind of National Guard situation. That just does not sound like the optimal path.
Yeah, not to. I don't mean it in a disrespectful way, but like in some ways, you're a freak accident, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you're the product of the law of large numbers,
Hmm.
where lots of people in similar circumstances with dysfunctional childhoods and chaotic early lives. That's why I was asking before, but for like a couple decisions, you would just be closer to the statistical mean, right?
Hmm.
And so like I say this about Donald Trump all the time. He's the millionth monkey banging on a typewriter that actually writes Shakespeare, right? I mean, like the things he does in his own, like the principles and values that he follows are a recipe for failure for most people. But you get a big enough sample size and they're going to work for a handful of people, and they've worked for him. He's been very lucky. You have more agency than I'm describing to Donald Trump in this extended broken metaphor, but it's the point is like you can't count on
Yeah.
the events that broke your way breaking for large numbers of people. I mean, all the kids that you were in foster care with, like not many of them went to Yale. And
Yeah.
which does raise the point I wanted to ask you. I don't know a lot. I mean, a lot of what I know from the foster system is basically from what I've read in your book, and and the little bits I get from pop culture and whatnot. And it seems to me there are very few places in life that have such a weird disparity of or divergence of some of the greatest human beings imaginable who are willing to take in troubled kids, and then some really Dickensian bad people who take in troubled kids for the wrong reasons. You know
Hmm.
what I mean? Like you hear about messed up foster parents doing terrible things, and I'm just, what is your sense of the people who, I have to believe that most of them are profoundly decent people who are doing it for the right reasons. But what is your sense of the people who are the foster parents, if you watch things like The Wire, you do not get a great impression of foster care,
Yeah.
either on
Yeah.
the bureaucratic side or on the family side. How should, like, if someone just sat next to you on a plane and was like, yeah, so what do I need to know about the foster system? Is it full of good people and bad bureaucracy, or how to think about it?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, so just quickly on the point about the being a statistical anomaly.
Mm-hmm.
I try to emphasize that throughout the book too, that I didn't want this book to be that kind of conventional bootstraps narrative. I mean, I guess if
Right.
people really want to read it that way, they can, but I spent quite a bit of time concentrating on the lives of my friends who grew up in the same circumstances as me, and they didn't go to college at all. They didn't go to Yale or anywhere else. Of my five close friends, yeah, two went to prison, one was shot. Other friends are kind of working menial jobs for low pay, and they're doing okay, but they're not particularly happy. And then in their personal lives, one of my friends, he has two kids with two different women who he doesn't speak to, and that's kind of where their lives ended up. Now that we're all in our early 30s, and So I wanted people to know that, like, yes, I have this unusual trajectory, but the kind of modal outcome for a young male who grows up in that kind of environment is not mine, but it's more like my friends. Um, and so, yeah, you can't count on recreating or replicating my path for everyone. Um, but for the foster care system, I one point that because I tried to remember the experiences, and then I read a bit about the system, and one thing that I didn't realize until I started writing the book was just how instability is kind of baked into the system on purpose. So people will ask me why I lived in 7 different homes, and not just say one or maybe two, over 5 years. And the reason is that the reason why kids are placed in so many different homes is because typically what happens is that someone from the family of origin re-enters the picture. So if a kid is placed into care, let's say the kid doesn't know his dad and his mom is on drugs, like my situation. Often the mom will sober up, or an aunt can come in, or maybe the dad somehow returns, and then the kid can go back with them. But if the kid's been living in, say, one foster home for a year or for 18 months, and often what happens is the kid will become attached to the foster family and will be reluctant to leave and go back with either a family member they don't know very well or haven't met, or with a parent who maybe has mistreated them or neglected them. And from the foster parent side, they often become reluctant to relinquish the child if they've been caring for a kid for 18 months, and then they start to become attached and emotionally invested. And then the family of origin, someone comes in. And so this can create complexities around loyalty and devotion and attachment. And so the system has organically solved this issue by moving the kid every few months, and in some cases every few weeks, so that the kid will never become attached. And so parents will never become too attached, so that relationship never cements. But for someone like my case, there really was no need for me to be moved so frequently. The reason why I was eventually placed into adoption is because, at some point in the final foster home I lived in, the 7th home, it was ordered by, I think, the state of California. Every so often you have to get a mental health checkup, and so I saw this child psychiatrist at the LA Children's Hospital, and he actually carefully reviewed my file. And this doctor was like, "Oh, this kid's dad, no one knows where he is. His mom was deported back to South Korea, so that she was arrested, but that was not her first run-in with law enforcement. So she was deported back to South Korea. I was an American citizen born in LA, and so they just placed me into care. And so this doctor recommended that I be put up for adoption, and someone listened, and then things continued from there. But that should have happened right away. But I got absorbed into this bureaucracy, and no one actually carefully reviewed my case to recognize that, I didn't need to be put in a holding pattern of homes for so long. Um, and the homes I lived in, some of them were quite, like I mentioned that they were teeming, lots of kids, kind of overfilled. But the parents themselves, they were okay. I think what happens for a lot of foster parents is especially for new foster parents, you start out with the best of intentions. You want to provide a good home for a kid. But once enough kids enter and leave your care, I think this callousness does form, where you become invested in a kid and you want the best for them, and then they leave and you never see them again. And so you withhold something because you don't want to feel that emotional pain each time a kid leaves. And so a lot of these parents were kind of neglectful or kind of emotionally cold or withheld. And, I think to some extent it's understandable. Other homes, I talk about the final foster home I lived in, the only home I lived in where I was the only kid living there. And what a strange experience that was for me, after living in, like modern day orphanages. But suddenly I'm the only kid in this home. And this foster mother had her own agenda where, she essentially liked to take young boys in. And I would rake the leaves and clean the gutters and clean the pool and all these kind of chores and tasks that she had assigned to me to keep up the house and keep up the yard and the maintenance. And, her justification for this was that it kept me out of trouble. I think some of that was self-serving logic. But, it was really mixed bag. Some homes were good, some homes were not so good. and it really runs the gamut. I don't think there's a kind of typical kind of home, but I do think generally most parents get into it with the best of intentions, and you can only have so many of those experiences before it starts to change you. It certainly changes the kids in those environments, but it changes the adults too.
I mean, I can't get over this point you make about the enforced the intentional instability point. I mean,
Hmm.
we know a lot about kids' psychology now, and the idea that you will keep moving kids around so no one gets attached, it kind of has a banality of evil to it, right? I mean, there
Hmm.
that is like, if you sat down in a meeting and said, all right, what is a program without physical abuse where we could most screw up the most kids, and putting them in one home after another, and right at the cusp of emotional attachment and the kind of character formation you get from trust, you yank them away and put them in a new environment. Like, there must be paperwork on why this is a bad idea, and yet, I mean, according, you're saying that it endures. I mean, that's messed up.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, and I think one reason why it has endured is because kids have no political power. They have no way to unite and agitate for their own collective interests. They're for many reasons. They're young, they're unsophisticated, they can't vote, like all these things. And so, I open the book somewhere in the preface with this quote from Nicholas Christakis, the sociologist and physician at Yale, who, the quote goes something like, in the history of the United States, all of the policies around childcare have prioritized the concerns of adults, and what was best for kids was a secondary concern. And, adults, policymakers, and parents, and foster families, and social workers, and everyone else, they decided that this was the kind of least bad way to handle the situation. And even if that's not true, it's not as if the kids who are actually bearing the costs can do anything about it. There's no way for them to make clear to the adults around until it's too late. Uh,
Mhm.
and then these kids end up in prison or homeless or involved in substance abuse and other issues. There's a few stats I have throughout the book. One was that 60% of boys in foster care are later incarcerated, compared with only 3% who graduate from college. So if you're a boy in foster care, you're 20 times more likely to be incarcerated than to graduate from college. And there was one study I note at the end of the book that upwards of 60% of adolescents in foster care are on at least one psychiatric medication. And so what that means is that the best predictor of being on a psychiatric drug in the US, uh, even stronger than genetics or family history, is being in foster care. That's the number one predictor of being on a psychiatric medication. And I think some of that is due to perhaps there may be some genetic issue, some family issue involved, but I think a lot of it too is if you spend your most formative early adult years, that sort of developmental critical window, being shuffled around to different homes, by the time you reach puberty and your body's already going through these dramatic physiological changes, um, then yeah, people may decide that you need to be on some kind of drug to mitigate harmful behaviors, either to yourself or to others. And this may either kind of exacerbate predisposition to mental health issues, or it can cultivate them and create them where they otherwise wouldn't have been present. So yeah, it's messed up. I agree, but I dwell at length in the book about how adults, even with good intentions, can often be very selfish and can find ways to justify to themselves that kids who are neglected or mistreated or what have you, that if it doesn't affect them personally, then somehow we manage to mask it or disguise it from ourselves.
Yeah, first of all, like, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, made this point about the need to regulate young fatherless men 70 years ago now. Like, what was the Moynihan report?
Hmm.
And since then, I mean, I don't have access to the numbers. You may know them, or at least have a directional guess that's better than mine. But I would suspect that the number of masters and PhDs in social work have quintupled since 1965.
Yeah.
Maybe tenfold. I don't know. The bureaucratization, the social work bureaucracy in many cities and states, never mind at the federal level, has to have quintupled. I mean, again, I may be wrong by a factor plus or minus 5, I don't know, but the numbers have increased enormously. And it is just astounding to me that given all of the rhetoric about the children, and all of the resources that are funneled into the helping professions, right, or the managerial class, if we want to talk in Burnham terms, and something so obviously bad for kids is routinized and bureaucratized to that extent. I think banality of evil kind of gets at it, right? I mean, it's just like hiding in plain sight. It reminds me, I was teaching a journalism class once, and this girl, evangelical Christian, wrote this wonderful piece about the problem with a lot of church organizations have you do a summer of missionary work or a semester of missionary work. You go off to Africa and you work in these orphanages and that kind of thing. And she said that the dilemma that they ran into was that you send these young, relatively privileged, mostly white American kids, they become friends with these orphans. And then right when these kids are really starting to form a real bond with these kids go home. The Americans go home and go back to school. And so it actually makes things worse for these orphans in these war-torn African countries, because the lesson they get is that it's sort of orphan tourism rather than actual lasting emotional bond and commitment. And I find it amazing that people can sit around a table and say, okay, what are we doing here? And allow these kinds of thhere to perennially just sort of continue. And I'm sure I'm going to hear from people in this universe saying, oh no, we are aware of this problem, we're trying to fix it, and here are the 10 reasons why it's hard. But it's just kind of galling to me.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that as the decades have wore on, there has been sort of greater attention paid and resources and people who work in these professions, and yet the number of kids who are raised in instability. And I just read this this statistic the other day in NPR that the number of kids in foster care in the U.S. has doubled since 2000. And this is primarily due to substance abuse issues and the opioid crisis and sort of related factors. And so, if you were to travel back, I think to, maybe when the Moynihan Report was written, or even further back than that, say 1945 or 1946, and ask someone, you just jump in your time machine and then ask someone back then, in the future, there will be X number, X times more social workers and people who are involved in education policy and social mobility, and there will be access to these advanced reproductive technologies for birth control and abortion and all these other things like family Planned Parenthood, all these ways to sort of mitigate whether you have a child, whether you have a child out of wedlock, you have much more control over family formation. And do you think there are going to be more kids who need homes, or fewer, more kids born out of wedlock, or fewer, more kids in orphanages and foster care and on substance abuse and all these other things, homelessness? There is a kind of a paradox there. And I do think that a lot of it is related to sort of changing values over time. I know a lot of people want to blame economics, and I think that may play some non-trivial role here, but I think a lot of it is sort of values and priorities and concerns. And I cite this stat from Coming Apart, actually, in the preface, that in 1960 95% of children born in the US were raised by both of their birth parents, And by 2005, for the upper class, it dropped to 85%. So a slight decline. But for working class families, it dropped to 30%, from
Mm-hmm.
95% to 30%. And so now if you visit these kind of working class communities, it's, to see a kid raised by two married parents is an anomaly. Um, it's true where I grew up and in many other parts of the country. And there were poor people in 1960 as well. And yet their families looked nearly identical to wealthier families. And today that's no longer true.
That's a good place to segue because we spent longer on the Dickensian nature of foster care than I planned. To move to your idea of luxury beliefs. So, and you cite Charles Murray. We were talking offline how he's a friend of mine. One of the core takeaways from Coming Apart is the problem with elites is they won't preach what they practice, which is sort of an inversion of the standard charge of hypocrisy, right? The elites actually have pretty bourgeois, moral codes about success sequence stuff. Get married before you have kids. Have a good job before you get married. Get a much education before any of these things. But they're terrified of sounding judgmental or preachy to people who need those values more, because they have less access to social, moral, intellectual, financial capital. So anyway, explain your idea of luxury beliefs and how it fits into all of this stuff.
Yeah. On that point, I've been thinking about this sort of non-judgmentalism, not preaching what they practice. That seems to only hold for these kind of conventional bourgeois norms. But elites are very eager to cast judgment and to stigmatize and to preach what they practice with other kinds of behaviors like recycling, attitudes around climate change or sexism or racism or they're very willing to abide by the norms and also coerce others or strongly suggest others abide by those norms themselves. So it's really interesting. There's this kind of inconsistency. I used to think that they were very sort of non-judgmental, laissez-faire, but only for practices and customs that I guess code as conservative or code as conventional or bourgeois. With the luxury beliefs idea, I coined the term and started working on it and writing about it and developing it in grad school when I was doing my PhD at Cambridge. This was 2019. But the idea started to take shape in my mind essentially like within months after arriving at Yale in 2015 as an undergraduate. So I was 25, got to Yale on the GI Bill. And it was a very rapid transition. I got out of the Air Force. This was August, started class in September. And then in October, we were sort of in the full swing of what became known as the Halloween costume controversy with the Christakuses. There were sort of student eruptions at Yale, but then at other campuses around the country, sort of throughout the mid to late 2010s. This was like an ongoing phenomenon. And I came at this kind of a complete outsider to the disputes in higher ed and the purposes of education and institutions. And, is the goal to teach our students how to think? Is the goal to achieve some semblance of social justice, or at least a narrow ideal of social justice as we define it? And then I would have conversations with students who would, take very sort of interesting and non-judgmental or even negative attitudes around things like marriage and family formation. I would have conversations with students where they would tell me, and not just undergrads, these graduate students too, and they would tell me that the family, like the that marriage was outdated, that idea of the monogamous relationship and that kind of family is outdated. We needed to move beyond it. It was a sort of relic of patriarchal oppression. And then I would ask these students how they were raised in their own lives. And every single one of them told me they were raised by both of their birth parents. I get into the statistics. People who attend elite universities The vast majority of them are raised by two married parents. And then I would ask them how they planned to raise their own families in their own lives. And they would say, well, I was kind of raised that way, and those are the things that I was exposed to and that were kind of inculcated. So I'm going to do it. I'll probably get married and have kids that way too. But their official, their official stance was that it was outdated. And so what I heard from them was that, you know, I I personally benefited from this age-old institution that led me to study at a place like Yale, and I plan to carry these benefits forward for my own kids, but other people shouldn't do this. Um, and there are a variety of other luxury beliefs I described. These luxury beliefs are ideas and opinions that confer status on the upper class while inflicting costs on the lower classes. And a core feature of a luxury belief is that the believer is sheltered from the consequences of his or her belief. And so other examples include things like defunding the police, or holding sort of laissez-faire attitudes, or around sort of hard drug decriminalization, technology use, things that disproportionately affect people who are lower on the socioeconomic spectrum compared with people who are affluent and educated and have economic resources, who have the kind of cognitive and cultural and social capital to, you know, preach one set of values while privately living by another. I don't know who coined this term, or this phrase, that the new elite, they walk the 50s and talk the 60s, but I think that helps to sum it up.
So how much stock, Jonathan Haidt, in Coddling American Mind, actually he's going to, I'm talking to him tomorrow on the Remnant. He's my next guest. Nice. Jonathan, part of his argument, and he's not alone in it, but he sort of did the most to popularize it, is the fragility of the college kids that you were going to school with, that and basically young people today, stems from the sort of hyper safetyism that they were raised in from a very young age. I see it among the kids of my daughter's cohort. I live in a nice area of Washington, D.C. She went to a private school. I'm not in favor of bullying of any kind, but the zero tolerance for bullying atmosphere that pervades all these elite schools basically leads kids to basically be taught that anything that makes them feel unsafe, unloved, unrespected, is a kind of violence. Right, unvalidated. And so it sort of, because like my view is political correctness, wokeism, whatever label we're going to put on this stuff, is a very old thing. What's different is the market for it has wildly expanded because of these kids. You always had like really kind of silly women's studies professors who would teach off the wall kind of things. But they would have a very hard time getting a lot of kids to major in their stuff or to show up in their classes. And now this idea of sort of that violence is speech, but speech is violence, has much more power with young people. And it's perfect kindling for a lot of what I consider generally to be asinine ideas and ideological positions. That's not really part of what you're arguing, right? But so how does it fit? How do you reconcile that argument with your stuff?
I mean, historically, there has like thin-skinnedness has been a property of the aristocracy, of, how dare you, speak to me that way, that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, so that's as far as I can think of as it relates to the luxury beliefs framework. There are different kinds of like sociological ideas and empirical findings in modern social psychology that I draw on to support the idea. The basic claim is that luxury beliefs have to a large extent replaced luxury goods. Kind of loud luxury has become vulgar. It's become, ostentatious. It's not very fashionable anymore. And so I draw on the work of Thorstein Veblen, the sociologist and economist from 1899. He wrote The Theory of the Leisure Class. And so he wrote at length about how the elites of his day exhibited their status with their clothes, what they wore, tuxedos and evening gowns and delicate and restrictive attire, pocket watches and monocles and top hats and these kinds of things. And today, it's less obvious just by looking at people and what they're wearing and how they dress and the material possessions they carry with them, who's rich and who's poor, the way it was 100 plus years ago. And so my claim now, and this is drawing on the work of Pierre Bourdieu from the mid 20th century, who developed this idea of cultural capital, that the elites of the mid 20th century, they converted their material resources into cultural capital, the way that they spoke, their intricacies, their hobbies, having arcane knowledge around wine and artwork and travel and geography, and sort of knowing this information that you could only have access to and think deeply about if you went to an expensive school and you had a lot of leisure time to think and interact and meet with people who carried these kinds of high status ideas. And my claim now is that luxury beliefs are kind of the latest manifestation of cultural capital. I also draw on the work of Michael Knox Barron, who wrote Wasps, The Splendors and Miseries of an American Aristocracy, terrific book. And he writes about how WASPs in the mid 20th century, many of them would support fashionable ideas because they would abhor the vulgarians. And they experienced a bit of pleasure at the thought of supporting movements and ideas and causes because the masses would be upset by it because they were unconventional. And I think there's a bit of that going on as well, that, if the masses hold one kind of opinion, then if you are a graduate of an elite university, then you can explain how that opinion is unfashionable or hurtful or harmful or whatever kind of moralized language we use in order to essentially code the opinion and the expressor of it as low status and outside of that elite segment of society. So yeah, I don't know if I can wokeness in itself. I think not all of it necessarily is luxury. Completely overlaps with luxury beliefs. I think a lot of it does, but luxury beliefs, I think, are a new way of essentially signifying that one attends or has attended an expensive college and works the kind of job where they have the time to read the right books and the right prestige media outlets and the right podcasts and sort of imbibe all of the opinions that allow one to signify that they are a member of this new elite in society.
Yes, look, I am very sympathetic to the luxury belief stuff. I've given a couple of talks that borrow on some of your stuff on this. I'm kind of fascinated with shibboleths. And one of my theories has been for a very long time that I don't think it's original to me, but it's one I've subscribed to, is that one of the reasons why Asian American kids were disproportionately discriminated against by elite universities isn't because there's this new fixation with the yellow peril at Yale or Harvard or anything like that. It's that those kids are disproportionately from first generation immigrant families, and they have not and so they're more working class, or they're more bourgeois, and even if their parents are professionals, the professionals from a different culture coming here, and they're here for like classic American immigrant reasons, and they want their kids to get good jobs. They're weird about how they want like their kids to be doctors and lawyers, which is the time honored strategy for immigrants. Jews are the best example. Like, you don't want your kids to be a doctor or lawyer to become rich. You want your kids to be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer so they won't be poor, which is a different thing, right? It's a hedge thing because they have experience with poverty. And so they just don't have a lot of time for the luxury belief verbiage and the shibboleths. And so when they don't speak that language, and it's a tell. And I think that, so the Asian kids who are multi-generation Americans, who are basically have assimilated into woke or whatever we want to call it, they speak the lingua franca of social justice, and they live that that style in their transcripts and their resumes and their recommendations, and they're the ones who get in. But the kids who like, yeah, I want to go to college to get a good degree so I can get a good job. There's something in the luxury belief category of the administrators that they don't think that's their job anymore. They think their job is to form a kind of elite that believes certain things, and being a school that just produces successful workers is just a lowly aspiration for this generation of administrators. Anyway, that's my view of it in crude
No, I
terms.
agree. Yeah, that I wrote this piece a few years ago in Unheard. I think this was in 2020, actually, kind of at the peak of the political demonstrations and when things started to feel unmoored. Because I was reading some interesting studies on attitudes around. I think at that point the Supreme Court hadn't yet made their decision about affirmative action, but I saw this survey going around that basically young Asian Americans who were born in the U.S. were 3 times more likely to support affirmative action than older Asian Americans who were born outside of the country. And yeah, that to me is like a perfect example of basically younger, educated, aspirational elites, Asian Americans. They know that it's not enough to just get the right degree and to get the right job and to have the resume of someone who's professionally successful, but they also have to have the right opinions. And one of the right opinions is that having race-based policies around elite institutions is a good thing, and that once they've made it, once you've already received your degree, then it's fine for you to kick the ladder away for other immigrants who also aspire to be in the same position as you. And yeah, I think that this, I saw a lot of this at Yale, actually. Something that I was not really expecting to to see was this kind of tension that a lot of kids, children of immigrants, Asian and Hispanic both, they had this ambivalence about their own families because they knew that especially like the kind of a lot of the white upper and upper middle class students and graduates of these institutions would judge their families for holding these kinds of more conservative coded or more kind of blue collar ideals and beliefs around hard work, around working for an investment bank, not to get rich, but just to not be poor, to make enough money. That this is something you shouldn't aspire to, and instead you should work for a nonprofit or an NGO or something that, one of these high status, low paid jobs, which only people who come from wealthy families could afford to do after going to a place like Yale. So yeah, it was really interesting to me to see that. I felt that myself. I mean, every single time I heard, some kind of politically correct opinion, or what I later termed, some of the luxury beliefs, I would think about how the people I grew up around would receive that message, or even someone like my mom, who's a working class Democrat. This is why I think the luxury beliefs idea is more so about class than politics. Um, I focus a lot on the kind of income divides around people who earn low incomes versus high incomes, and their differing attitudes around defund the police, around family, and so on. People who have degrees versus people who don't have degrees. A lot of these divides are actually larger across the sort of degree or the diploma divide rather than the political divide. And so yeah, that also contributed to my irritation. A lot of what I was seeing on campus too was just, if that's how you feel about these views, then you're basically condemning the 65% of the country that doesn't have a college degree.
So how, like, on, I often joke on here about the remnant bingo card, concepts and terms that come up all the time, and my listeners do not want to hear me rant about the term Latinx ever again, or defund the police, which I know fits this. It sort of perfectly fits the luxury beliefs thing. But I guess the question I have, so sort of going back to sort of the hype thing, is one of the things on the remnant bingo card is I passionately hate monocausal explanations for anything. Things are, like earlier when I asked you that question, you said both, right? It's always at least both, and not, if not both, plus the 25 other variables that I didn't mention, right? And there's a real tendency to boil things down to single explanations for everything, particularly in ideological realm these days. And so how much of polarization, of the elite class divide stuff, do you think is explained by the luxury goods concept? Is it like, for like, I'm a big fan of elite theory, Italian elite theory stuff, and I can see a lot of this stuff having less to do with the signaling of the class. I mean, I entirely agree that the luxury beliefs thing is a real thing, but like, I don't know how much of this stuff it explains. Is it? And so I'm sure in some cases it's 100%, and in other cases it's 1%. And but it depends, because context matters. But one of the things I like about elite theory is that elites do things to protect their relative status among vis-a-vis other elites. And this is something, I hate the way our rhetoric boils down to elites versus everybody else, when in fact our culture is riven by a bunch of competing elites. Ted Cruz yells about elites as if he's not one, but the dude's a freaking senator. His wife is a manager at Goldman Sachs. He was the Solicitor General of Texas. He went to Princeton and Harvard Law School. He's an elite, right? And so the luxury belief stuff, that's signaling, but it's not necessarily signaling up down. Sometimes it's signaling side to side, I guess, is my point. And how much of the sort of ideological contortions and deformations that produce things like defund the police or Latinx, or insisting that mothers be called birthing persons, which is another one of my favorite ones, how much of it is explained by luxury beliefs, and how much of it is where luxury beliefs is an important but not the full picture?
I wouldn't say that it's like the luxury beliefs idea itself may not be the full picture, but the phenomena undergirding it might be. So, I gave the luxury beliefs idea a very, maybe this is the academic in me. Like when I gave it a definition, I was like in the midst of my PhD, I was reading tons of research papers. I'm like, oh, it has to be, very tightly confined. It can't be this, can't explain everything. That doesn't make a good scientific hypothesis. And so the narrow definition, is basically, does this belief confer status on the affluent, the elite, and does it inflict costs on the lower classes? And if the answer to both of those things is yes, then I would categorize that as a luxury belief. Regardless of whether it's intentional, whether it is deliberate or calculated or unintentional, maybe it's born of good intentions, but if it fulfills those two criteria, I would call it a luxury belief. But I'll briefly describe one of the interesting empirical findings over the last couple of years in social psychology, which finds that people who are at or near the top of the socioeconomic ladder are the most, they covet status the most. And so two different studies, so this is replicated, one in 2020, one in 2021, found that when you ask people when you collect objective measures of people's status, how much education they have, their earnings, their income, their occupational prestige, people who are at or near the top of these scales are the most likely to agree with statements like, it would please me to be in a position of power over others. I enjoy when people look at me when I walk into a room. It's important for me that I have influence over those around me, and so on and so forth. This, psychologists call it the need for status scale. And to me, this kind of helps to explain why why these newfangled beliefs are primarily held by people with degrees, and especially people with elite college degrees. They are vying for status. They're vying for prestige, esteem, respect, and the admiration of those around them. But I do agree that there is kind of intra-elite conflict as well. But even among elites, there does seem to be a rough consensus. There was that survey by Rasmussen. I saw the Wall Street Journal and other outlets covered it, which they basically they defined elites as people who were people who earned $150,000 or more a year, had degrees from elite colleges, and lived in metropolitan areas. And there was just this vast divide between their views on a variety of topics versus ordinary American voters. Something like 80% of these quote unquote elites believed that we should ration electricity and meat
Mm-hmm.
and gas in order to combat climate change, compared with only 16% of ordinary voters. The survey included questions like, does the U.S. provide too much freedom or not enough regulation? And elites were more than 50% of them said too much freedom, compared with a vanishingly small number of ordinary voters. And so I'm sure that sort of within the elites, there's going to be very they're going to be polarized views, but there is a bit of a consensus. And I think part of the reason why, like, if you collect the data on the political views of professors and students and inhabitants of elite institutions, and just in terms of their voting preferences and their political orientation, like, they do generally tend to lean more toward the left. Something like 90
Mm-hmm.
plus percent tend to favor Democrats. And so you do get the occasional outlier, someone like a Ted Cruz or a Josh Hawley. Um, and, a lot of these guys, they've sort of been immersed in these elite institutions for a while. And so they get fed up, and they sort of become class traitors or whatever, and rail against it. But I generally agree. Like, the kind of interesting disputes and the battles tend to happen at the very top. But I wouldn't underestimate people's desire to not be seen as one of the unwashed masses too.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, I think you're right about academia being uh, um, ideologically homogenous, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so um, but that's sort of part of my point, is that elites control different sectors of the culture,
Mm-hmm.
and the left, broadly speaking, controls basically the commanding heights of the culture:
Mm-hmm.
higher education, elite higher education, Hollywood, publishing, media, and that's not nothing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like, I didn't like the Rasmussen poll that much. I mean, I looked at it kind of closely, because I think it kind of captures there's a selection bias thing that we could get into about it. But my point is that the um Rene Girard, I don't think you talk about him in the book. I went down a rabbit hole with him a year ago. It's careful. It's kind of blue pilly, kind of, you can go crazy. But one of his concepts of victimism, right, where elites basically pick a constituency of unwashed victim population. For the left, for a very long time, it was essentially African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Now the problem they have is that African Americans, on average, are to the right of the elites that claim to be their protectors, and so in some ways, it's moved to the transgender stuff. Um, the right-wing elites tend to their chosen victims that they're the avatars for are the deplorable white working class, white men left behind kind of thing. But it's still a contest between elites doing very well at the top with just different constituent populations that they're claiming to be the spokespeople for. And I think it's condescending on both sides, right? And anyway, the last point I just wanted to get into, or second to last point, is I think the Veblen good argument is right. But I tend towards thinking about, there's an economist, Fred Hirsch, who's the guy who coined the term positional good. And so almost all Veblen goods are positional goods, but not all positional goods are Veblen goods. Because what a positional good gets to is, it's something that if you have it, someone else can't have it. right? It's and part of your point about the luxury beliefs is that everyone can have a fancy car and a fancy iPhone for the most part, right? Certainly, it really is not the tell of how rich you are that it would have been 100 years ago. And so that's the migration into these luxury beliefs. But a positional good is more about status, right? There can only be one best basketball player in high school. And if you're it, someone else isn't. And so one of Hirsch's points was that the mass prosperity has gotten to the point where, ironically, he said this in the mid 70s, no one can feel like they can get the American dream anymore of just living a decent middle class lifestyle, precisely because what people value is moved from the material to this, as you put it in your book, sociometric, right? The status stuff. And I think this is particularly poisonous in the era of social media, because what people value now are followers or likes, or retweets or whatever. And the conveyor of status is is being an influencer rather than something more concrete or substantial. And because of the way the attention economy works, you can have very high status by being an asshole. And this is one of the things that I think there's problems with Donald Trump is he would prefer positive attention to negative attention, but he would take negative attention instead of no attention any day of the week. And there's an enormous number of people on the left and the right who follow that same sort of mantra. Is like, as long as they're talking about you, you're doing something right. And I don't know that that's a luxury lifestyle, but I don't know if it's a luxury belief thing. Even though I think that plays into it. Anyway, what do you think of all that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I haven't, so I went kind of full circle where I thought that, status was like anyone could attain it. And then I kind of went back around to like this kind of zero sum positional good thing that if some people have it and some people don't, then this may actually introduce serious instability in society once we realize like, yeah, there can only be one best basketball player. There can only be one person with, or sort of one, like once one belief becomes prestigious, and then the others adopt it, that, there will be this kind of inherent instability as people vie for top dog status. But I've seen some interesting research around who seems to be more concerned with subjective status versus objective status, and it seems to be that people who are at or near the top of the societal hierarchy, people who are sort of at or near the top of the socioeconomic spectrum, they're the ones who care more about subjective status. There was a study from the organization's name is escaping me, but essentially they found that people who earned $100,000 or more a year were more likely, when given a forced choice, what's a more important issue to resolve, poverty or inequality? And wealthier Americans said inequality was the issue. And when you ask poor Americans who earn less than $30,000 a year, poverty or inequality, they say poverty. And I think that when you're sort of day to day scraping by and struggling to get by, you're not caring that much about what your neighbor has or what the people around you have, or the goods they have or the followers they have and so on. You care about your own situation. And then whereas once you have all of your needs met and you're the kind of person with that personality profile, high need for status, high will to power, whatever it is, that you are just a particularly competitive and ambitious and covetous person, and you want to best the people around you. And that drive, I think, is part of the reason why such people get to the at or near the apex of society in the first place. Like the reason why I think a lot of like why people who score highly on the need for status are also tend to have high earnings and tend to have high occupational prestige and so on is because they have this thing built in them where they want to be better than those around them. But most people, I think, aren't like that. I think most people actually do want to just live a good life, avoid poverty, and not think so much about where they stand in comparison to others. But I think that feeling is, for example, people have asked endlessly why the Ivy League schools and the elite schools don't expand. Given their outsized endowments, why not have more students at Harvard, say,
Hmm.
and you would have more graduates. You would expand educational opportunities. You would have more alumni to donate to you in the future. You could look at it as a financial investment, and yet they don't do it because, like you said, it's a positional good. And if suddenly there were twice as many Harvard graduates, that degree would be worth less, and people would compete less fiercely to attain it.
All right. So last question, and you were free to reject it entirely because everybody,
Okay.
I think, who qualifies for this hates this point. So, and I'm going to do it to Jonathan Haidt, which I've done it to him before, and I'll do it to him again. So I have this very unpopular view of what neoconservatism is and was. I would also argue that it's the absolutely correct view. Otherwise, if I didn't think it was the correct view, it wouldn't be my view. But the original neoconservatives of the 1960s, some of America's best social scientists, right? It was James Q. Wilson and Ed Banfield. You can go down a very long list. Nat Glazer, and Daniel Bell, right? And some of them were on the left. Some of them stayed voting Democrat for the rest of their lives. But what united them had nothing to do with foreign policy. Foreign policy neoconservatism comes like 15 years later. What united this crowd was that these were all social scientists trained in social science to one extent or another. They spoke the language of social science, and what they realized was the laws of unintended consequences, that the idealism of the New Deal or the Great Society wasn't dealing with the empirical reality of lived experience and how human beings actually operate in the wild. And so time and again in different sectors of life, they were basically discovering, holy crap, what my grandmother told me was largely true, right? That and it's like bourgeois values are good for a whole bunch of different reasons. Family really matters. Religious belief and religious observance, almost regardless of the theological precepts, yields better societal results for social stability, for family formation, for all sorts of delayed gratification, yada, 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 across a vast swath of things. And the problem now is that the term is kind of ruined, but like there's people like you, Jonathan Haidt, you can go down sort of this long list of social scientists, popular on the web, popular in to some extent in academia, though that's more fraught, who are basically coming up with new empirically grounded arguments for why our grandmothers were right. That sort of a lot of, I mean, not about racism and not about all sorts of bad things, right? But about these sort of basic eternal verities about how to be a productive citizen, about the importance of being a responsible father. You know, my friend Brad Wilcox at AEI, he's got this, you know, little book about marriage. My friend, you know, Tim Carney's got this book about raising families. And all they do is mine the social science data for proof that grandma was right. And to me, that this is basically, you know, on my remnant bingo card is bourgeois values are good. And they're good for white people and they're good for black people. And it is a crime to tell black people or Hispanic people that the values that are good for white people aren't also good for them, because they're actually good for them as an empirical matter. And it's racist and it's grotesque and it's a luxury belief to pretend that like white bourgeois values are only for white people. Anyway, so like I won't call you a neocon in public, I promise, because it'll just get you into more trouble. But what do you think about that? I mean, is there a kind of an insurgency about forget grandma was right, that basically some of the bourgeois values, you know, contentiously defined, whatever, are actually what are best for the largest number of people at scale?
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't argue with that at all. I mean, you know, when you said grandma was right, I thought about my own adoptive grandmother on my adoptive mom's side, and you know, it's so funny. Like I think about the generational changes just within my own adoptive family and how they've kind of generationally marched in lockstep with the changing values of the culture. So my adoptive grandparents met. My grandmother was 18, my grandfather was 21, I think. And he asked her to marry him after, just a few weeks. And she said yes, if he agreed to stop smoking, stop drinking, and stop gambling. And he said okay. And they got married. And they had, they were married for more than 60 years. And they had kids, my aunts and uncles, the boomer generation. And they all got married and had kids. And then they all got divorced. Very kind of boomer-esque. And their kids, my cousins who were born in the 1980s, they all had kids. None of them ever got married. Some of them don't talk to their kids or their baby mama. And now those kids were born in the early and mid 2000s, and those kids have a lot of behavioral issues, and they're just a lot of the kind of litany of symptoms that Jonathan Haidt describes in his new book.
Mm-hmm.
And these are the teenagers, some of them in their early 20s, and this is all the same family. Same genetics, same whatever, but they're responding to the norms and the customs and the culture around them and what's acceptable versus unacceptable. And yeah, I mean, it's I think that's right. I had this because you were speaking about how we're mining social science data and essentially coming up with common sense. and I had this conversation. I was at this dinner the other this is a few months ago actually, and I had this conversation with this vicar who was sitting across the table from me, and somehow we got around to talking about this book, Atomic Habits, which you may be familiar with, some of your listeners. This book about how you should basically like how to develop discipline and develop good habits. And the book is, a lot of it is, again, stuff that your grandma would know, like, delayed gratification, save for a rainy day, focus on the long term and not the short term, hedonistic, impulsive desires that you have in the moment. And so this vicar was telling me about this book. And it was like, a lot of this stuff is stuff that your grandparents knew, but it's dressed up in the language of modern social science. Mm-hmm. And this book has sold something like 15 million copies. And this vicar was like, this is scripture for secular people. Like a lot of this stuff is in religious texts and in parables and so forth in different forms. But the book itself is just like very much common sense things that but people, kind of modern, postmodern, secular, non-religious people can only be convinced by arguments now if you see percentages and standard deviations and studies cited and so forth, and not just older people knew this and it's in a religious text now. And so it's unfortunate, but in some ways I think it's unfortunate, but it's also nice to actually have empirical data. I say this as someone who got a PhD in psychology, and I am interested in statistics and survey data and so forth, but it is funny how often, we run experiments or look at correlational data and so forth. And, if that's what it takes to convince people, then I think that's okay. But I fully agree that it is a luxury belief to live by a set of norms and values and yet be willing to accept justifications and excuses and, kinds of forms of rationale from other people that you would never accept from yourself or from your own children, in the name of compassion. That these decisions that allow other people to ruin their lives.
All right, Rob Henderson. Again, the book is Troubled: A Memoir of Foster Care, Family, and Social Class. Thank you so much for coming on The Remnant.
Thank you, Jonah. This has been great.
So 2 things. One, do not close your browser on pain of death until your audio uploads. And 2, you can refuse if you want, but you'll be joining some of America's foremost public intellectuals. I have this incredibly stupid bit on this podcast where guest leaves, I do a little close, and then I say, I'll see you next time. And then the guest's voice comes back on and says, no, you won't. This is a podcast. It's an incredibly stupid dad joke. I'm trying to get rid of it. I cannot get rid of it. The listeners will not let me. You'll be joining Jonathan Haidt and Francis Fukuyama and a bunch of other people who've done it.
What do I say? No, you won't. This is a podcast.
I just need you to say, no, you won't. This is a podcast.
Okay, got it.
Just say it now. Just say the words.
Oh, just right now? Okay.
Yeah, no, we'll plug it in at the end.
Okay. No, you won't. This is a podcast.
That's it.
All right. Good.
If you spoke enough